Lord Owen, there's a further progress report that you received in October 1975, and we'll just look at that briefly. Henry, it's LDOW 5023. Oh, and there it is, thank you. Again, we don't need to go through it paragraph by paragraph, but we can see from the first paragraph that it's a response to a request for information, an update about the position of the centrifuges in the two regions. You are then told the position in the next paragraph about the centrifuges. You are told the position in paragraphs 3 and 4 about the regions. And then if we could go to paragraph 5, please, Henry. We can see that you're told that the current position, as at the 23rd of October 75, which is the date of this, after a series of written and oral exchanges over the past few months, both regions have now given us reasonably satisfactory assurances that they can and will meet the targets which we originally set them, and with only minor modification on the financial terms we first offered. We're now therefore in the position that all regions have agreed to take part in the programme. Satisfactory though this is in itself, it is no guarantee that things will run smoothly, and it will be necessary to monitor development closely. Arrangements have already been made for this to be done. And then if we go to the very top of the page, we can see your top right-hand corner is your handwritten note. I think that, again, that's your handwriting. Happily, I've also got a typed version of it. Good, my congratulations to. I attach a lot of importance to keeping to and, if possible, improving on our present target. Is this a further example of what you described as your role as minister, as the politician, was to try and ensure that the pledge that you'd made to Parliament the previous year was being delivered?
Yes.
And if there were problems, if it wasn't going to be possible to achieve self-sufficiency within the target of the 2 to 3 years, would you have expected your officials to be reporting that to you candidly?
Yes.
We know, and indeed you've already referred to it, that in December 1975 there was the World in Action documentary broadcast. We're going to watch that tomorrow, so I won't play it now. But I wanted to ask you to look at the transcript and just ask you to deal with one point. Henry, the transcript is at LDOW 5039, please. I'm not going to ask you about what you said, because we have it there, as it were, on the record. But if you could go to page 16, Henry, please. I wanted to draw your attention to a point that was being made by Dr. Watt, the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service. So it should be page 16, please, Henry. So we can see about a third of the way down, we have Edinburgh exterior, and we have the voiceover referring to factor VIII concentrate being made at the plant in Edinburgh. This plant is designed to produce factor VIII concentrate for England as well as Scotland, but so far no plasma has been sent here for processing from England. And then there is a reference to John Watt, and we see what John Watt said: we should be able at our capacity to more than produce the need of all plasma fractions for Scotland, certainly by spring of next year. After that, it will depend on the policy arrangements which have to be made between the Scottish Health Service and the National Health Service, the Department of Health and Social Security. The question is then asked, but if plasma was made available from England and Wales now, could you actually produce more factor VIII concentrate than you are doing? Answer, yes. How much more would you be able to produce? We could go to a capacity of 1,000 litres a week. And would that in fact supply the demand of all the haemophiliacs in Britain? No. What sort of proportion would it supply? A difficult question to answer. It would probably be around half, a little more than half perhaps. And then the comment from the journalist is, English plasma could be processed in Scotland now, but only if present policy is reversed. This rules that Edinburgh will not be used until Elstree reaches maximum output in 1977. Do you know whether it's correct that the policy was that plasma from England and Wales wouldn't be sent to Edinburgh until Elstree reached maximum output in 1977?
Well, from documentation which I saw recently, we had a meeting on this in next year, in 76, in which that was a meeting about this American company that wanted to be able to supply. And in the context of that meeting, it's minuted that I raised the question of greater cooperation between Scotland and Wales and England, and asked them to convene a meeting, which they did. And I think you have the result of that meeting. If you look carefully through it, it doesn't really grapple with this issue. And I don't know what happened thereafter, but pretty soon after that I was no longer the Minister of Health and was in the Foreign Office.
Were you aware as Minister of any policy or edict that, along the lines that is suggested here, that plasma from England and Wales couldn't be sent to Edinburgh until Elstree had reached its maximum output? Was that something brought to your attention as far as you can recall?
Well, it can only be inferred by the fact that I asked them to hold the meeting, which is pretty unusual, that I was not satisfied. But I can't really say more than that. And all I know is reading the minutes, I don't think it felt to be satisfied. And then, as I already told you about the article in the BMJ, which is a pretty strong attack on the mechanism of working in the delivery of the transfusion service in the UK.
Yes, I should say that the Cash article to which you refer is much later in the sequence. It's 1987, I think. But
the Cash article, I think, was 1980, wasn't it?
well, I'll double check. The position.
The only other thing I did was this involvement of Brian Abel-Smith, which was to try and see if he could look at the structures of how this was working, which I think he did.
It's certainly right. There were two meetings in 1976 where the question of Scottish-English cooperation is touched on, and we'll look at those. The first is the one that you've mentioned. Henry, could we have DHSC 303742 _ 076? And if we could just, thank you very much. So we can see it's a meeting of the 21st of January 1976. We can see that you're present. And paragraph 1, the meeting had been called at Dr. Owen's request following his consideration of a submission. We don't sadly have the submission, but we'll come on to documents later, about an application from Armour Pharmaceutical Company to supply Factor VIII to haemophilia centres. Now just pausing there, what involvement did you generally have in the time you were Minister with applications from pharmaceutical companies of this kind?
Normally, a supply contract would not come to me. And it says at the top of the meeting will be called at Dr. Owen's request, following his consideration of a submission about an application from Armour Pharmaceutical Company to supply Factor VIII to haemophilia centres. So I'd obviously seen this and requested the meeting. So we were looking at the fact that they were cheaper, why were they cheaper, and quite a big difference. But then it's clear that they had some technical problems with it, so it wasn't necessarily going ahead.
And if we look further down the page, Henry, if we could go further down, we can see in the bottom part of the page, there's a discussion about the quality of the products from Elstree. They're said to be inferior to the Scottish product. And you asked that the Scottish laboratory and Elstree get together to discuss processes and share technology, and you asked for a progress report.
Yeah, within a month.
But that's a slightly different issue, I think, to the issue thrown up by the World in Action programme. This is talking about, was Elstree's product good enough and could it be made better?
Yes.
just in terms of your dealings with the ARMA submission, and again, I appreciate you're hampered by the fact that we don't have the submission itself that apparently triggered your desire for a meeting. But if we go to the very top of the page, the subject is Factor 8 product license.
Yes.
Again, maybe that you can deal with this matter generally speaking as Minister, did you have any involvement in the product licensing process?
Not normally, but if there was a problem, and I suppose they would say this was politically sensitive, which it certainly was, but I doubt I could stop it if there was we're governed here by trade agreements between the United States and Britain. You don't have a ministerial selectivity over this, but if they've in breach of the proper standards, and solubility was one of them, you could stop that. On the other hand, you couldn't just stop it because it was a contract, and particularly since you weren't giving them any guarantees, far from it. You were reiterating at the bottom of this letter a statement that they should understand that we were abiding or trying to abide under the injunction from the WHO, which was sent to all departments of health all around the world, to do your best to get away from paying for donors and relying on commercial blood supplies, which we certainly were. So you were effectively telling ARMA, the mere fact you've been allowed to bid for this, and even the fact that you're at lower cost, is going to be overridden by our overall commitment to follow the WHO criteria, which I strongly approved of.
And that, if we can go to the second page, please, Henry, just so that we can all see what Lord Owen is referring to. The minute records, Dr. Owen agreed that negotiations could start with ARMA Pharmaceutical, but he asked that it should be spelt out that the overall policy of the British government was in line with the WHO recommendation to aim for self-sufficiency. And what was the purpose of spelling that out to ARMA?
To indicate to them there's no good coming back and saying you've just recently agreed that we can come in, and you never mentioned the fact that you were ultimately coming to a point where you would actually say you can no longer supply blood. And so it was, I would think, no more than fair practice and honest dealing. You were authorizing it, but they had to understand that it could be stopped at any moment. We were self-sufficient.
And then there's a second meeting in March 1976 on a different topic, but it deals with the question of England and Scotland cooperating. Henry, it's CBLA 40343, please. We can see from the attendees, so we see the date 11th of March 1976, and then we can see from the attendees that it involves representatives both from Oxford and Elstree, and obviously the department, but also from the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service, the Scottish Health and Home Department, and the PFC Edinburgh. And if we go to the second page, please, Henry, we can see the first paragraph says, the chairman opened the meeting by explaining that the Minister of State, who was taking a particular interest in the production of Factor 8 within the NHS, had recently reaffirmed the intention to achieve NHS self-sufficiency by the middle of 1977. He was anxious that there should be maximum cooperation between the production units in England and Scotland, both in achieving the target figure and reversing any preference which some users might have for one or more commercial products. It would appear you've communicated to your officials your desire to ensure, it may or may not have been triggered by the World in Action programme, I don't know, but your desire to ensure proper cooperation between England and Edinburgh. And this meeting is a result of that. If we look at the second paragraph...
I didn't quite understand that. Can you speak up a little
bit? I'm
so
sorry, Lord Owen. Yes. It would appear from the first paragraph that you have indicated to your officials your desire that there should be maximum cooperation between England and Scotland. I don't know whether that was prompted by the World in Action programme or whether you're able to recall that or not.
I don't think it was prompted by the World in Action programme, because there wasn't much that in the World in Action programme that was news to me. And indeed, I don't think it was to anybody who'd read Titmus's book. There was much there that was not known. It was why I welcomed it, because it was giving it much wider, millions of people watch that television programme, and it gave it a much greater prominence, why we were concerned, why the logic for self-sufficiency. And they were able to spell it out in ways I couldn't do. That's why I welcomed the programme. I mean, they were running risks of libelous allegations. If you look really, they were saying some pretty tough things about the Skid Row and the way there were no safeguards at all in commercial products. And this was a big company, Haemophilia. It was Baxter, which is a big American company. It was a brave program.
The second paragraph of this, the notes of this meeting, if we just look at the very last sentence, please, it says, Dr. Maycock drew attention to the fact that the UK target was set by the expert group on the treatment of haemophilia in March 1973, and that there were those who now thought that the target should be considerably higher. Do you know whether you were told that it was being said by Dr. Maycock that that the target should perhaps be higher, or that some thought the target
it already
was
was by then. In 76, we were already knew we were on target to produce a good deal higher than what we had said in 1975. And that's what happened. In 76 and 77, we surpassed the commitment. I do think this is pretty important to realize, that we didn't just meet the targets, we surpassed them. That wasn't my effort, that was the department. And all these people who were cajoling Scotland, cajoling the regional transfusion units, who consider themselves independent. I mean, that was one of the problems. That's the delicately phrased thing about some who would prefer to go on taking commercial products. Even when there was this increased production. So, I mean, that's a delicate way of saying that we had to pressurize them to take account of what was already underway and deliverable. So we were already able to cut back, but there was this rising curve coming up. So we knew that we'd have to go on doing it. And that's the whole question of recurrent expenditure. There was no doubt. I don't know when budgets were fixed, but we were well aware that we would have to spend more, hopefully not too much more. And that's why Scotland was important, because they already had the capital equipment. So if you could get them to increase their production. And that was the most obvious logical way to have a quick gearing up.
In April of that year, 1976, 29th of April, you addressed the World Federation of Haemophilia. And I think we can see that from LDOW 5044, please, Henry. You've got the text of your speech, but this is a press release from the Department of Health and Social Security. So we can see here, UK aims to be self-sufficient in supply of blood products. Dr. David Owen today strongly supported the World Health Organization policy that each country should be able to supply its own blood and blood products to meet clinical needs. He told the World Federation of Haemophilia Congress at the Tara Hotel, London, that the NHS was not at present able to provide sufficient factor VIII concentrate needed by haemophiliacs for the management of bleeding, and health authorities were having to buy expensive imported products. Following a special allocation of £500,000 last year, substantial progress was now being made in building up production capacity in the NHS, and self-sufficiency in home-produced factor VIII was expected to be reached in mid-1977.
This isn't on our screen.
Oh, I'm so
afraid.
sorry. Is it on?
I've read it, so I do remember it, but...
Ah. Well, I think I can ask the question I want to ask about this document without you seeing it, but we will need to rectify that for a handful of further documents.
I think we just need to check that there's nothing gone wrong with the link, because it's on all the other screens that I can see.
Yes. Henry.
So if you would be so kind, Lord Owen, just to bear with this while
refer to
technician
this
checks.
in my evidence.
Okay.
I've only got a short extract of the what I said at the conference.
Well, I can ask the question I want to ask, I think, without
Yeah.
reference to the document. The document, in a
Fine,
sense, was for
yeah,
the benefit
okay.
of others. You were saying then your expectation was that self-sufficiency would be reached in mid-1977.
Yeah.
And that was presumably based upon the information, the progress reports that you were being provided by your officials.
Right. And that speech would be, it was a formal speech, so it would have been seen in the department, have been checked against delivery. It was one that was going out internationally, endorsing the World Health Organization. So I think you can be absolutely certain this was not just my whim, it was the view of the department, having had all these discussions, having monitored the process of all the machinery that was necessary, what was going wrong in Elstree, and also taking possibly some account of maybe more cooperation over Scotland.
And then, again, just continuing with 1976, you left your post as Minister for State for Health on the 10th of September 1976 and moved to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. I think...
Which come up now.
Oh, good. I think the answer to this may be obvious from what you've just said, but it's an important question, so I'm going to ask it again. When you left office, did you understand the target of self-sufficiency to be within sight?
Yes, 77, definitely.
Your successor was Roland Moyle.
Yes.
And I think David Ennals had taken over from Barbara Castle in April of that year as Secretary of State for Health. I don't know what the process in government was, but were there any handover discussions or any communications on this issue between you and your successor?
Well, I knew him and liked him and respected him. It was not really necessary to have discussions because the continuity came from the private office. The people who were running the private office, I think, continued for some period of time. And that's, why private office records are kept and why it's such an extraordinary thing to find the whole of my private office records were pulped. So the record, because the private office was driving this program, I mean, let's be blunt about it, that's what was happening. So the documentation in the private office, which he would inherit, was part of the continuing pledge.
Now, we know from the documentation that we've looked at that the £500,000 was spent on regional transfusion centres to improve the plasma supply. Other than
I think on 3 centrifuges for BPL.
Yes, just about to come to that, sir. Other than the provision of centrifuges to BPL, I think it's right that none of the £500,000 was earmarked for any work on BPL.
I don't know the answer to that question. You'd have to look at the various documentation, split this up as to what was going to be happened. But if it was necessary for BPL, it would have been put there by officials.
We do know that, and this is after you left office, but towards the end of the 1970s and in the early part of the 1980s, BPL was effectively condemned and had to have substantial works undertaken to it. Was that something, the potential rebuilding or significant investment in BPL, was that something ever discussed with you by officials?
Of course. BPL came up all the time as trying to be a factor in expanding production. But again, reiterate, it was done. I mean, where's the figures from Roland Moyle answering questions in 78 or 79, showing the figures for 75, 76 and 77, all show that this policy was being followed. And if I may say so, I do find it really quite extraordinary that there can be this attempt to try and pretend in 2001, when they're answering a question in the for Mr. Lord Hunt, this thing that the only reason we're going for self-sufficiency was cost. I mean, that is a blatant lie. And I don't understand how that could have been put through the department. The department knows perfectly well. Maybe it was just a briefing by a SPAD, you know, these political advisors that have come in since my day. I don't know, but it is an absolutely monstrous accusation, and it can't be allowed to go unchallenged. It is absolutely clear that the reason for self-sufficiency was the contamination of blood in products coming in, but products that were needed for patients' care. And we couldn't suddenly stop it without a disastrous effect on them. But we had to put every possible effort into getting the self-sufficiency as quickly as possible. Maybe it would slip a little through no fault of anybody's, but it can't be allowed to slip well into the 80s. And even when you got the heat, that didn't solve the problems because there were other issues. And then you go into HIV, of which, well, to a great extent, this is outside my service, but self-sufficiency was not related purely and simply to factor 8. Self-sufficiency was a reading of what's going to happen in the future with other infections that we will not be able to diagnose and that we will have to live with contaminating patients unless we can do something. But, you know, British blood taken with the best will in the world. You can't tell every single person when asked whether you've ever been yellow, answered that one truthfully. But it was much more less likely, put it that way. But all blood is in risk of contamination.
Lord Owen, you've touched on this in your evidence already about the way in which the regional transfusion centres and the regional health authorities were effectively autonomous. Was consideration ever given, whilst you were Minister of State, to the possibility of centralising the blood transfusion collection system rather than having this fragmented, localised system?
Well, all I have is in front of me is this very short letter to ask Brian Abel-Smith to look at this. I'm pretty sure that was in my mind, but I can't, to be honest, say definitely it was. But it was a hot potato to do with it. And during the initial thing, I don't think I wanted to rock the boat organisationally. I wanted the best commitment possible out of them all, and I was relying on the Department of Health officials to do it, and I think they did it. And I think they did a fine job, and you'll notice quite often I said excellent. And when we were lagging behind, they caught up. And when they themselves reported on various items of equipment which were absolutely crucial, and were watching it like hawks, because they knew I was watching it like a hawk, but they were committed to it. These are good and honest people conducting a policy at a time of very great difficulty of financials. You know, the spending years were over now then. We were facing a very difficult economic situation. So we were we knew we'd have to rely on our own resources, squeezing other parts of the department to get this through, and they were committed. I thought I should mention, just while I'm on that subject, I don't know whether, it must be in your files, but there is a Dear Doctor letter from Henry Yellowlees, which is dated 1st of May 1975, which does go into the geographical factors behind hepatitis. You're aware of it, are you? You're
yes.
going to ask me about it.
I wasn't specifically going to ask you about it, Lord Owen, but it is a document we're going to be looking at tomorrow.
It does reveal the sort of way in which the Chief Medical Officer brings together all the facts and then gives, I suppose you could still call it advice, but it's pretty much an instruction.
Well, thank you for raising it, and it is a document that the inquiry has. Wanted to just play a short extract from the 1980 documentary Blood Business, in which you gave a short interview. So it's after you've left office, but you were interviewed about the issues that we've been discussing. Henry, it's MDIA 40109, I think.
He acknowledges that no government has put in enough money.
We don't have it in.
Well, I don't think we've invested enough.
We don't have it visually at the moment.
If I thought then, on the best evidence that I had, I think it was 500,000 that we found was going to be sufficient. But what has happened is that although we have increased, as I gather it, production, demand increased as well. I left, ceased to be Minister of Health and went to the Foreign Office in 1976. But I think what has been needed is a steady investment, and not just into blood products laboratory, but also into the regional blood transfusion services, which have been starved of money. And it's the old system, you see. There's nobody really arguing for them within the system. The acute hospitals are taking money in times of expenditure restraint. It's very easy to forget this sort of area. It's a vital area, and yet it's often been the Cinderella, I fear.
But there has been pressure for more money. In Newcastle on Tyne, Dr. Peter Jones, a leading authority on haemophilia, has campaigned for major investment.
What should have been put in is something more in the region of £25 million. And since the country is at present, as a whole, putting out between £2.5 and £3 million just for haemophilia, leaving aside lots of more common disorders, then in the long term it would have made a saving and economic sense.
Surely no one could have foreseen the explosion in demand for blood products, particularly factor VIII.
That's not true. The present demand was known 6 years ago, both by doctors involved with the care of haemophilia, by the Department of Health and by the government.
People in the blood transfusion service say that they think you ought to have found more money than the 500,000 you did.
I'm sure they do. I think it was jolly hard to find that money then. I was one of the first people to really invest in it. I suspect, in retrospect, if you tell me we haven't kept pace, we ought to have found more. But as I say, I was there in 75 to 76, 74 to 76. But I believe at the time that was meeting the demands of most of the experts, and I certainly believed it was a high priority.
Could you just make a first try?
Stop the playing there. I just wanted to show you that and then just ask you a little more about this question of demand. Again, your evidence has already touched on it. What system was there in place in the department to gather information and to work out how demand was likely to increase in the future?
Well, there was this advisory committee which the Chief Medical Officer conducted, and you drew attention to it when, right back in George Godber's time, when he asked Dr. Bridges whether she would come on the advisory group. So there was a constant monitoring of this demand. And then, as we've said in earlier questions, there were those who thought self-sufficiency included prophylactic use. The department didn't accept that at this stage. There was a difference, openly acknowledged. But everybody who's in their own speciality can come before the Minister of Health and ask for more money and have a perfectly rational, good case for it, which I would agree. The question is priorities. And that's Naren Bevan's famous phrase, the language of priorities and the language of politics. You have to make choices. They're not easy, and particularly when financial times are not good. The health service is like that. But overall, I'm a strong believer that in the National Health Service, the whole system, doctors are given a real say in priorities and trying to choose it. The voice of the individual GP, the clinician, is heard within the system, and compromises have to be made, and effectively it's rationed. But it's rationed on a pretty enlightened system where individual doctors can say what that doctor said powerfully and believes it, but it could be matched by a renal surgeon or a dialysis unit. So you have to choose. I think we made the right choices in 75 and 76. Obviously, I do. I think that somewhere, which is your job to find out, when did the money itself start to limit it? And I'm not sure where that is, to be honest. I don't know.
Before we look at events after you were Minister, one last question about your time as Minister. I don't know whether you'll be able to answer it or not, Lord Owen, but with the benefit of hindsight, with the benefit now of the full hindsight that you have, do you think there is more that could or should have been done in that period 1974 to 1976, and if so, what?
Well, you asked the question in a way it's very difficult to answer. More that could have been done or should have been done. More could have been done. You could have put vast resources, the 20 million that the doctor wanted in 1980. You weren't going to get 20 million for it in 1980, and you certainly wouldn't have been able to get it before. We started on an investment program. We made a public pledge. We fulfilled those requirements and our targets over and above which we'd anticipated, fortunately, because demand was increasing. I don't know. I hate it. I hate the saying there wasn't anything more we could have done. There's always more you could do. But you've got some idea of the resistance to this policy, this choice. I think we did, and I don't say me. I believe the department understood that we had made the right decision. They backed it and they stayed with it. And many of those people were staying on in office long after I left. So I believe that collegiately we made the right decisions.
You remained in government until obviously the election of 1979, but not in the Ministry of Health. Do you recall any further discussions within the government that you were privy to on this issue?
Well, the Foreign Secretary is travelling around the world quite a lot. I can't and didn't attend even every cabinet minister. I was in Africa negotiating and in a lot of other places. But I don't think I did try to come back for the main economic committee, which I was also on. I can't recollect it ever coming to cabinet or to the main economic committee. And it wouldn't really. It would be dealt with internally within the department in their own resources. This was not a controversial decision. It was never criticised outside government. Even the Treasury never, to my knowledge, singled out this as the wrong decision, because they'd often criticise in the yearly budget reviews, well, you spent money there, you spent money there. And it would come back to me through Mr. Giddon and others, saying the Treasury are very unhappy about spending this there. They took views on our priorities. I don't think they ever challenged this priority while I was there.
Just going to ask you a little about some of the subsequent statements made by government ministers that you've referred to in your witness statement. I'm going to pick it up first of all in 1978, June 1978, Henry, it's RLIT 40272. So we can see it's, you see the date there, Lord Owen, and you'll see the question that's posed of the Secretary of State, referring back to ministerial statements made by you, whether the self-sufficiency has been achieved, and if not, asking for an explanation of the reasons. And then we can see the answer from Mr. Moyle, the production target of factor 8 set for June 1977 was attained. However, new opportunities in the treatment of haemophilia and associated disabilities have been developed which have made further clinical demands for factor 8. And then the question is asked, how much of that £500,000 had been allocated? And the answer is the whole sum was used to increase factor 8 concentrate production within the National Health Service. And then if we can skip over the next question, Henry. There's then a question of what the current shortfall is and what action's being taken. And Mr. Moyle says current amount of factor 8 is approximately 30 million international units per annum. Total usage is estimated to be approximately 45 million international units. Regents are being asked to provide more fresh frozen plasma. In the meantime, quantities of commercial factor 8 continue to be purchased to meet clinical demands. And then the question is asked what additional central funding has been allocated to the blood transfusion service to improve blood fractionation. And the answer there is for 1978 to 1979, a total of 145,000 have been allocated to the central processing laboratories in England to enable them to increase the production of blood products, mainly of factor 8 concentrate. So that we can see that the £500,000 that you had, your word pledged, has been spent on the purpose for which it had been pledged.
And achieved the purpose for which it was achieved.
But self-sufficiency itself not achieved for the reasons here outlined by Mr. Moyle.
No, but these historic costs, historic figures, there may be been answered in 78, 79, they're going on now into a different financial years. But for the years that were ahead, they fulfilled their criteria and they expanded it. So I don't, it's not for me to say, but just looking at those figures, it doesn't appear to me that self-sufficiency has run into a brick wall at this juncture. In 77, 78, 79, they're still putting money into it.
I think if we then look at RLIT 40264, so RLIT 40264, thank you. So we have, this is later in 1978, end of 1978. The question is if the Secretary of State will make a statement on his success in rendering the NHS self-sufficient in the provision of freeze-dried factor 8. And then Mr. Moyle answers, gives information about the estimated need and the rate of production, and then says this: the extension of clinical requirements, however, means that self-sufficiency has not yet been achieved, and my department is therefore reviewing production in relation to present demands and resources.
Well, again, unpredicted projections forward have largely been met because we overproduced, if you like, what we wanted to produce. So it was a running target, and he accepts this, and he wants to find more resources to it. That seems to me that my reading of this. He says self-sufficiency has not yet been achieved, and is therefore reviewing production in relation to present demands and resources. So he seems to be on side for the pledge at the moment. I don't see any reason to go back and say we're not on track, but you know it's a moving target, that's the thing, and you're starting getting these elements. I mean, it would be interesting to know how much was being put on prophylactic use, whether it was just a small amount. I suspect a rather small amount.
If we then move on to December 1980, so this is the new government, It's RLIT 40268, please, Henry. And again, you've referred to this in your statement.
This was a debate, wasn't it?
Yes.
German debate.
That's correct, Lord Owen. And if we go to page 5, we'll see who's speaking. The Under-Secretary of State for Health and Social Security, Sir George Young. And then if we go on to page 9, please. At the very bottom of the page, it says, the motion also refers to the declaration of the 28th World Health Assembly utilisation and supply of human blood and blood products, which in essence urged WHO member states to try to be self-sufficient in blood and blood products. The honourable gentleman referred to that. The principle of self-sufficiency is one that the government fully endorse, quite apart from the possible risk of hepatitis from imported products, particularly those manufactured from plasma supplied by paid donors. The very fact that products are imported, unless they come from a country that produces an excess of such products, raises difficult moral issues concerning trade in blood. But self-sufficiency must inevitably be a long-term aim. Do you regard that as the same pledge or a dilution or change in the pledge?
I read the entire speech of the minister, and I must confess I thought it was a pretty good statement. He also made a lot of criticisms of relying on markets and commercial. He seemed to be on side for self-sufficiency. A long-term project, well, he's right, isn't he? I mean, you know, self-sufficiency is driven by all the time trying to find contamination and developing techniques to get rid of it. And so somebody must have been starting to working, I mean, the whole antibody assays and things were fairly new science. I mean, the HIV virus was detected by its antibody, not by heat treatment. So heat treatment wasn't getting rid of it. It was the finding an antibody titer, I think, is the main. You're taking me outside my realm of expertise in terms of a minister, but just of a general interest in it all. But I think that it's not my job to defend the minister. He's not even of the same party as mine. But I don't read that speech as somebody who is disowning all the policy of the previous government.
I think what you've been asked to do is to contrast his statement that it's a long-term aim from your view that self-sufficiency, not simply the spending £500,000, but self-sufficiency could be achieved within 2 to 3 years and was going to be achieved by 1977. Here is the health minister saying some years later that it is now a long-term aim, by which I take it he's not putting a figure of 2 to 3 years on it.
Yes.
So that's what I think you're being invited to comment on.
Maybe.
Well, what's your view?
I don't like the, well, one word, long-term. I'm rather against trying to finger other people and try to blame other people and to read into their speeches things that I do not know. I only know what I did, and I don't think I'd have used that word because it has the implications of your question behind it. Maybe that was... I have to say that that speech was taken by Mr. Cash in his British Medical Journal attack on the blood transfusion service, and said that by the early 80s, the government were talking the language of self-sufficiency but weren't supporting it. And he said, despite the speech made in the adjournment debate. So he cited that as being language which was all right, but was not being matched by commitments. I don't know. I don't even won't get too much into getting into Mr. Cash's, but he was the head of the Scottish Blood Transfusion Service. And it was meant to be a helpful, though critical, editorial. It wasn't totally damaging. I mean, he just felt he ought to speak out about that. So I think that we were talking about self-sufficiency, of not relying on commercial donors. That's what we were really doing. We were self-sufficient in blood for British use, believing that we could get enough donations and enough fractionation and enough quality products to keep pace with demand. But the demand was coming from clinicians. And here the big unforeseen factor was prophylactic use, which, as I said earlier, was later accepted as being a legitimate demand. But there was this difference of opinion in the department when I was setting the self-sufficiency limit. That then later incorporated prophylactic use. And I'm not saying it shouldn't either.
Lord Owen, Henry, if we could have on screen RLIT 40267. This is a statement by Kenneth Clark that you've already referred to, so it would be useful to see it on screen. This is a question asked of Mr. Clark on the 19th of February 1985. What studies the National Blood Transfusion Service has taken into the economics of self-sufficiency in Factor 8, and if the results are to be published? And the answer is, we decided in 1982 that this country should become self-sufficient in blood products. And you've referred also, I won't take time going to it, but you've provided the inquiry with it, and it's exhibited to your statement. You received a letter from Baroness Trumpington, which essentially said the same thing.
Well, that's the year when I began to get worried about what we were doing. I mean, Hancock I knew well, so I probably had some involvement in the question.
And you've expressed a degree of puzzlement in your statement as to how it could be the government was saying in 1984 that was a decision taken in 82.
Well, a junior minister in the government, which he was a member, 2 years earlier, had said they were in favour of self-sufficiency. And he's now saying we decided in 1992 that we should become self-sufficient. The German debate response and this are not compatible.
This in due course, I think, became part of the basis for your complaint to the Ombudsman in 1988. Now, again,
did it?
Well, perhaps you could summarise, Lord Owen, rather than me attempting to do it, what your complaint to the Ombudsman was in 1988.
Well, I think it was a cumulative argument about maladministration. I mean, the Ombudsman was set up with great fanfare of publicity, and it was considered a great opening up of healthcare to scrutiny, and MPs, instead of relying on questions and answers, could get maladministration looked at in the round within this ombudsman principle. Ombudsman is a foreign word, and it was greatly enthusiastically accepted by members of Parliament as a big advance. I think it was Dick Rossman who did it. I can't remember now. And slowly, now in retrospect, even in legislative form, we narrowed the terms of reference because governments don't like being scrutinised, to be honest about it, by and large. And first of all, it's difficult to prove in a letter, but I tried to get them to focus on the fact that there was no one decision that was involved here. It was cumulative decision-making, and that you can only really get at that by an inquiry from within, who, looking at the documentation, You don't expose that in parliamentary questions or adjournment debates. So it seemed to me absolutely tailor-made for the Ombudsman. Well, the first thing that was done is you had to have an individual case that you had to be able to represent. So I approached the Haemophilia Society, which I've always found to be very good. You know, I'm sure they were critical of some things I did, but I mean, that doesn't matter. They were trying to be a representative voice for haemophiliacs, and in my view, have done sterling work over many decades. And they approached privately a person in my constituency who was a haemophiliac and had actually caught AIDS, was suffering from AIDS. And I went to see him, and he agreed that I could use his case and preserve his secrecy, which I did. It's not always easy, these things. So I met the criteria on that issue. So then we found that they still wouldn't investigate it. Then I tried to revive the case, and this was told I couldn't revive the case because I was now a peer, and it could only be done by a Member of Parliament, the House of Commons. Well, I'm a strong supporter of the House of Commons and not a great supporter of the House of Lords, which is an appointed chamber. So I can't say I was terribly upset about that. I mean, I'm more important that members of the House of Commons have it. But it certainly was not prepared to accept maladministration. If I look back on this, I don't personally think there's been evil men or bad decision-making consciously. I think there has been a general maladministration of this issue over a long period of time, and I think it was an absolutely classic case that should have been exposed by the Ombudsman system. Well, it didn't do it, and I hope in your recommendations, sir, you will look at this, and Parliament should, in my view, re-legislate for it, because I think that the Ombudsman is a good system when dealing with such a complex question as healthcare, particularly.
And just so that those who are listening understand the particular issue that you'd raised with the Ombudsman, there's a whole chain of correspondence, and I won't go through all of it. You've provided it all to the inquiry, and it's been disclosed. But you've said this: the crucial commitment to become self-sufficient in blood products was made when I was Minister for Health, a commitment made after careful consideration and quite a bureaucratic battle in order to avoid the necessity for imported blood products. I am appalled that this commitment was never secured. As a result, infected blood has been introduced long after it need have been. And then I think in your subsequent correspondence, you raised the point with the Ombudsman about no minister had come back to Parliament to say if it was no longer the policy that was the case.
Yes.
And you could not persuade the Ombudsman to even initiate an investigation?
No, not only that, requests took months to answer, and then they claimed to have lost the files and that they couldn't go back over the previous correspondence, even if that's just that they have not invested in that and enough to keep proper records. It was a pretty extraordinary situation.
I wanted to deal next with the issue of the loss of records relating to your time in office. Again, you've alluded to this already in your evidence. Your private ministerial papers, your private office papers. First of all, could you just give us a brief idea of what those papers would include? What kind of material would be in there?
Well, to be frank, I only really know more about what are my private papers when I was Foreign Secretary, because they are in my possession, and they're in my possession, but I've given them to Liverpool University, so they're part of archives in Liverpool University. By and large, they are things which the private office think are personal to the minister, where the minister's leading the discussions, and not just necessarily making policy, and something that is interested in him sufficiently to want to keep this. There is a selectivity going on really mainly by your private secretaries, and sometimes you say, for my private files, for my private things, because you know that you want to keep it. But in this case, it wasn't just this. It was not. This wasn't the culling which Lord Jenkin mentioned of the papers. He calls it a cull of his own papers. And I don't know how much he lost of his own departmental, of his private office papers. I lost a whole lot. So it was nothing to do, everything else that was going on, and a great deal was going on. Smallpox eradication program. These are the sort of little things that come. They ran out of money. The chief medical officer came to see me with tears in his eyes, saying, I need an extra 2 million to keep the teams in the Ethiopian mountains. So I said, fine. But he said, how do you get the money? I said, I'll just take it from something else. That's what you can do as a minister. Now is something which would go in my private files. Smallpox, it would just be there. And you don't find that now, because there are no papers left. Now, I just don't know what happened, and draws distinction between this and what was then done in culling relating to first haemophilia and secondly AIDS. So this was before AIDS, nothing to do with the various admitted in Lord Crisp's evidence. And there, incidentally, they talk about that this culling took place in early 1990s, mid-1990s, late 1990s. So it's a pretty extraordinary span of, but mine are different. Mine are just my whole papers were taken out, we think, in 88.
And you've produced and exhibited to your witness statement a document, it's LDOW 40318. No, that's not it. Sorry, so it's LDOW 40318. I hope. Yes. So this is an exhibit to your witness statement, Lord Owen. It says DHSS records, papers have been destroyed, normal procedure after 10 years. Now, as I understand it, this is not a DHSS note. This was a note made by someone in your constituency office?
In my private office, at the time there were probably 4 or 5 people working for me, and this person was dealing with constituency letters. And that's just her handwriting, reporting on a telephone conversation she must have had with the department, saying that I wanted to make an appointment for Lord Owen to come and see his private office documents, and was told that their papers had been destroyed, normal procedure after 10 years. Well, since then we've told that there isn't any normal procedure for doing it after 10 years. Remember, in those days, I think the 30-year rule was still applying, that you couldn't divulge your own private documents without permission in certain key areas. So then it was 20 years, and now it's not really a fixed year period, but they say there was never a 10-year period. But she was a very reliable person, and I'm sure that is an accurate account of what she was told. And so there was no papers for me to go and see. And we think it's in the constituency section, because the person I was told to go to the Ombudsman, I had to have a constituent, that she was dealing with correspondence with him because he was a constituent. And that makes us think it's very definitely towards the end of 1988. Towards the beginning of 1988.
And indeed, that's when you were making your complaint to the Ombudsman in February 1988. and at some point in the sequence of correspondence with the Ombudsman, you relate to him that you've just or recently learnt that your private papers have been lost or destroyed.
Yes, I think I did.
And just to be clear, your private office papers from your other ministerial posts at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, you have?
Yes.
They're in the archive that you've referred to in Liverpool?
Yes, some go to the National Archive, and some are just over and they've got no use for them, and they asked me whether I wanted them, and they were totally delighted to take them all, give them all, and they were pushed up to Liverpool.
Now, the second document that you've exhibited to your witness statement on this issue is at LDOW 40350. I say on this issue, it's on the question of documentation more broadly. You will see this is a memo dated the 15th of December 2003. Your name is at the top, and it's MSH, so the then Minister of State for Health, had asked for a full background note on the review of internal papers between 1975 and 1985 and comments by Lord Owen about the destruction of papers from his private office at the time. And then if we go further down the page, please, Henry. We see in paragraph 5, it refers to a review that had been undertaken. It says that was not set up to address Lord Owen's comments about his papers from his period as a minister being pulped. And then it says this: unfortunately, none of the key submissions to ministers about self-sufficiency from the 70s/early 80s appear to have survived. A search of relevant surviving files from the time failed to find any. And then there's a suggestion, one explanation for this is that papers marked for public interest immunity during the discovery process on the HIV litigation have since been destroyed in a clear-out by Sol. This would have happened at some time in the mid-1990s.
Well, it was obviously a mistake that this was included in the letter.
It was a mistake that you saw this memo?
This document, yes, was it. That wasn't meant to be sent to me. That was a briefing for him to send the reply to me. So then we realised that something more was going on.
In terms of your own direct knowledge, do you know any more about what happened to any of your papers?
No.
Now, it's right to note that we've been provided with statements from Lord Hunt and Lord Crisp by the Government Legal Department, which respond to various observations in your statement. I'm not going to take time now in going through the paragraphs of their statements, but they will, in accordance with the inquiry's normal procedures, be disclosed and placed on the inquiry's website as a response to criticisms made in your statement. But I don't know whether there's anything further you wanted to say, Lord Owen, on the issue, specific issue of destruction of documents.
No, I read it, but I don't wish to make any comment. I think it's over to you is the answer to that.
Lord Owen, I wanted to finally ask you, before we break and others have the opportunity to suggest any further questions, I want to just ask you about a speech you made in Parliament in November 1989. You've exhibited it, again, I think, to your witness statement. It's LDOW 40349. We can see the date, 23rd of November 1989, debate on the address. And we see that your contribution starts at the bottom of the page. But if we could go on to the next page, please.
Is this going to be relatively short?
Yes, it
Ms.
is.
Richards?
Yes, it is. We can see, if we pick it up down in the bottom half of the page, left-hand column, you refer there to the infection of 1,200 haemophiliacs with HIV. And then the very bottom of the page, you say, I feel personally responsible. You refer to your announcement on January 1975. And then if we can just go to the next hand column, you set out the pledge that you made. You say you repeated it. And then you refer to what was then said in 1982. And then you've said this: I've tried to persuade the Parliamentary Ombudsman to investigate this issue but failed, for if ever there's been a clear and graphic case of maladministration, this must be it. And then you say this: we are all responsible. I just wanted to ask you, Lord Owen, what you meant by that statement, we are all responsible.
Well, when a policy is announced to the House of Commons by the government of the day, it becomes the responsibility of the House of Commons. I mean, it's the whole point of trying to commit a parliamentary democracy is that you can examine the policies of the government. Many of them are not important, or don't carry, they're not what you would call a policy. They're a reaction to circumstances. But as you see it today, the Speaker is very keen that ministers, even Prime Ministers, make statements to the House of Commons, not to the press. And the whole issue is that that's where your democracy is debated. That's where you are held to account by your peers. And so when you make a statement to the House of Commons, and in my case, repeated statements about a policy, it is the possession of the House. And if you now change it, you should tell them. At least that's my interpretation of the democratic processes. You know perfectly well we don't have an unwritten constitution, so everybody has their own view, but that's been broadly the view upheld by successive speakers. And if you want to change the policy, then you come and tell the House of Commons you've changed it. If you've announced it to the House of Commons, in that sense, they possess it.
Thank you. Sir, is that a convenient moment for our
Yes, it is. And I think you've more or less finished the questions you have to ask, except for those that may be suggested to you by others.
Yes, this is an opportunity during the break for those who represent call participants to suggest any further questions, and then after that for Lord Owen to make any final observations that he wishes to make.
I will be very brief. I've said all I need to say already.
Well, it's been a long day, but I will detain you just a little bit longer, if we may.
Okay, no problem.
Can we come back aiming for 4? You may need more time. If you do, you'll let us know, and we'll let you know, Lord Owen.
Right.
It'll be 4 or shortly after. So 4 o'clock.